everyone had a good lunch and takes an orange home this weekend. So we are going to continue our work, understanding sort of the world of property valuation and education taxes by going next to the property tax credit. And in a reverse of this morning, Julia is going to start the testimony and Jake is going to finish the testimony. Julia, do you need a pen?
I usually have one in my hand.
No.
We can get you one. Oh, I've got one right here.
Floor's yours.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. There is another presentation on the committee page under my name. This one is the review of the property tax credit. I will go ahead and share my screen. The same document that you've got posted online. Perfect. So I was asked to come in and give a little bit more of a deeper dive into the property tax credit, the income sensitivity portion of the Ed Fund and Ed Finance. So diving straight into it, outline. First, I'll start off talking a bit about a review of the property tax credit, how it's calculated. We'll go over the property tax credit lag, which I know many of you have likely heard about, but what that actually means and how it works. We'll review a calculation for an income sensitized homestead, a homestead that's reviewing a property tax credit as a bit of an example, and then a brief chart on property tax credit recipients. So big picture, I know I talked about this one of the times that you've seen me, the property tax credit. But in essence, the property tax credit, it's written out on the slide as a PTC to save some space, but that's what PTC stands for, property tax credit. It's a credit that's based on income and it's applied to homestead property taxes if a household qualifies. About 2/3 of Vermont households receive some size of property tax credit. Jake actually, preview to what he'll talk about, he's actually put together a really cool table that shows by income, you know, what percentage fully pay on income, what percentage fully pay on property, what percentage pay some portion. But about 2/3 receive some form of property tax credit. And lastly, there's this lag, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but the property tax credit is applied on the following year's tax bill. So in terms of, this is a high level summary in this table of how the property tax credit is calculated. We use household income for calculating the income portion of the property tax credit. This is a special definition solely for the purpose of calculating Vermont's property tax credit. Essentially, the way that you think about it, if you haven't filed a property tax credit claim in Vermont, it asks you for the income of pretty much everybody living in that homestead. So if my husband and I were both to file for a property tax credit, we'd be putting my husband's income, my income, anything else that we're receiving in terms of income. And that's sort of the way that we calculate household income. There's different lines, I guess you want to call them, for, I can't think of the word, for household income that are included in statute. There's that 47,000, the 90,000. Those are the two parameters for household income in statute. And those parameters refer to the way that the property tax credit will be calculated for households with that income. So below 47,000 households, there's something called the circuit breaker. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, what it means. And then above 47,000, there's to 90,000, there's $400,000 of equalized property value that can be used. Then once you hit that 90,000, the property tax credit is only calculated against the first 225,000 of equalized property value. I'm saying equalized here. This is a throwback to this morning's presentation about the CLA. Equalized is if that house site were to be appraised at 100% of fair market value. House site is also a particular definition that's really referring to that the dwelling itself and the 2 acres surrounding that dwelling. And then as we spoke about briefly on Friday, there's in FY 25, this limit, if you want to call it a limit of 115,000 of household income. And this is the point at which a household will no longer qualify for the property tax credit. It's essentially a break-even point. JFO in consensus with the tax department calculate at what point would a household never qualify for a property tax credit.
Can you emphasize that? Because I have been getting regular emails, this like from other members and a little bit from the public, but from other members. I think people think that that's a threshold we set in statute rather than math. So can you just say it all one more time?
Absolutely. So there's some thresholds that are in statute. That's your 47,000 and the 90,000. The upper limit, if you want to call it a limit, that's nowhere in statute. It's really a math exercise. JFO does it in consensus with tax annually. And essentially what we do is we're calculating the 2 lines where you would pay on property and you'd pay on income. And at some point, those lines are going to cross. And once those lines cross, a household would never qualify for a property tax credit. It would always be cheaper for them to pay on property than it would be for them to pay on income. And so that's really what that 115,000 is.
So would another way to say that be to say that if your income is over 90,000, you only pay on the first 225, but after 115? Because because the width of that band is set by that point of no return.
Sorry, the width of which band?
The 115, if that's a mathematical equation, you could just say that that band is not really a thing. It's just a band. No, I'm just trying to find a way to explain it to my people because I've had this conversation. And the point is they could apply, but they wouldn't get anything.
Precisely. Yes, they could apply, they wouldn't get anything. And going back into, I think what you're getting at, like the intuition of a property tax credit, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, how much would the household pay if they were to pay on property? How much would they pay if they were to pay on income? And then whatever the delta is, if they were to pay less on income, that's the credit amount. That's what we're crediting back. But I have an example in here with some numbers if that's helpful for folks. And there are some cases in which a household, and Jake will speak to this, there's some cases in which a household's income, in theory, they would qualify for a property tax credit because they fall into one of these brackets. But in fact, it's cheaper for them to pay on property than it is for them to pay on income. So in those instances, they're not receiving a property tax credit because their property tax credit would be that they would need to pay more dollars back to the state to pay on income. You know, their liability would be higher on income.
Yeah, a while back, I don't know, 6 weeks, I'm guessing, Public Assets Institute put out a paper or on where we are with property taxes and people who are having a hard time affording it, and their suggestions, and I can't recall them exactly, were to tinker with the couple of ways of the 90 between 90 and 115,000 group. And I think they may have mischaracterized how those things work. I got their point. I mean, they were suggesting if we want to help that group, that's where we might look. It's probably worth revisiting that paper. You can probably find it at pai.org.
I will,
But it's one sentence.
yeah, go ahead.
But it couldn't be taken lock, stock, and barrel as presented. That's my point.
I'm happy to have them in to present that, that policy idea. I've heard Julia before describe sort of any of those changes as like balloon squeezing. And I think, not to get back to this report again, but the income-based education report has really good explanations of what happens when you squeeze different parts of this system and sort of what pops out. separate from actually the policy implications of the income-based education tax. If anyone wants to dive into that, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So you talked about percentages of people who use this. Do you have a geographical spread of where that's used?
Where a geographical spread of households receiving the property tax credit? Yes. And at the end, well, I don't, the Vermont Department of Taxes publishes an excellent overview on their website every year. There's actually a link on here. I think Jake has included it as well. But it breaks out by income group or income bracket. It also breaks it out by town. So you can get a sense of that, but I don't have that off the top of my head, but I'll certainly make sure that you get the link.
That's great.
Back to you. Okay. So that's high level. What is the property tax credit? Going into a bit more detail, this slide should also look familiar, maybe from last week. But this is essentially interpreting the income yield and how this income tax rate is calculated. And I've included this here to really reiterate the point again, that the property tax credit is based off of this income tax rate that is dependent on local spending decisions as well, right? So we're calculating, so another piece that is sometimes misunderstood, I'm not saying by the committee, but questions that I ask is, well, I receive a property tax credit or I pay on income, so budget votes don't impact my tax bill. In reality, as we can see in the equation, in fact, they do, right? The property tax credit is based off of an income tax rate that is in part dependent on per pupil education spending. So moving deeper, getting into what is often referred to as the circuit breaker. This is for households with income less than 47,000, and this 47,000 is included in statute. Essentially, households under 47,000 are entitled to a further property tax credit that makes it so that their net education tax cannot exceed a certain percentage of their income. So what we're seeing here in these tables, I'm first this one on, I guess that's your left, for the statewide education tax. You can see these brackets again for household income, and there's a tax cap. So household income up to 10,000 can only pay 0.5% of their income on statewide property taxes.
Do you know how many households fall into $47 or less that are also receiving a property tax credit?
Off the top of my head, I don't. It's also included in that link that I promised I will send you all. It's written out there. I will say, I guess it's my third bullet here, that in general, about 30% of homesteads that are eligible for a property tax credit are further eligible for this circuit breaker, if that makes sense. But I will be sure to send that data along.
It's about 39,000.
And do you know when the $47,000 figure was put into statute?
I do not know. I am going to phone my friend John from Ledge Council, who may also not know, but he's better with the statute than I am.
Will you repeat the question?
Yes, when the $47,000 figure was put into statute?
I can find out for you, but I think this is a long term, it's been a long time since it's been, but I can.
Right. Just thinking, for like, wages have been going up, just not enough to keep up with inflation. So I imagine that this is the amount of people who own a home that are making less than $47,000 a year. I imagine it's probably a shrinking figure.
Can you identify yourself for the record?
Yes, John Grayhouse, the Legislative Council, I can give you that here. Yep.
Thank you.
All right, so we've got the circuit breaker, right? If you're below this 47,000, depending on what bracket the household income falls into, that household can only pay a certain percentage of their income for statewide education property tax. Just like the property tax credit in general, the cost of this circuit breaker is also borne by the education fund. That credit is included in the Ed Fund outlook in that property tax credit line. There's I guess a sister program, if you want to call it that, for municipal property taxes, in which, like the circuit breaker for the state ed tax, there's a circuit breaker for the municipal property tax, where, if the household income falls between these brackets, they can pay only a certain percentage of their income on those muni taxes. The cost of that property tax credit is borne by the general fund. So you've got the circuit breaker included in the property tax credit borne by the ed fund. And then the muni circuit breaker property tax credit borne by the general fund.
One brief interruption. Is everyone hot and would opening a window improve our lives?
Please.
That would be lovely. Thank you. John, do you want yours or do you want a different one?
That one, the storm window's already open.
I know, but.
I'm fine,
Sitting-
I'm fine.
What do people?
Got it. I think you just went the wrong way there.
Okay.
To you.
Property tax credits, heating things up.
Oh, yes,
I just
Representative
wanted
Brannigan.
to say, I think that municipal property tax is a lot older than the ed tax.
We will find out soon.
Okay.
It's been a long time.
Okay, so that's the circuit breaker. So this slide is probably a bit maybe too small to read. But it is included in the slide deck in case you want to look at it in more detail later. But essentially what it is I put this together a couple of years ago, trying to spell out like all of the different iterations of if your household income falls into this bracket, then how is the property tax credit calculated? So essentially the way to read the table is we've got our household income here in the far left column, and then the house site value. You'll recall that, let's just keep it simple and go, you know, if your income is 80,000, household income is 80,000. The property tax credit is then calculated up to 400,000 of your equalized property value. And what we do here is we say, okay, how much are you paying on property? And then we calculate the amount if you were to be paying on income. That's what this middle column is with all the formulas. And we say, okay, how much did you pay on property? How much did you pay on income? If you would have paid less on income than you paid on property, then you get a property tax credit for that difference. If you would have paid more on income, well, then it's a good thing that you paid on property and you don't get a credit. So that's the math of how the property tax credits are calculated. There's also this other piece of the puzzle where the property tax credit is on a lag. And what that means is that folks who receive property tax credits will see their bill reflecting the current year's property tax minus the prior year's property tax credit. So for instance, we're looking forward, all the Ed Fund outlooks that we're going to be looking at over the course of the session are looking at FY26. So we're talking very often, usually when I'm in here or Ezra, my JFL colleague is in here, we're going to be talking about FY26 or further out. But just for the purpose of FY26, thinking about somebody's FY26 property tax bill, they will see their FY26 homestead property tax minus the property tax credit that corresponded with their FY25 liability. So that sort of process rolls forward every year. The property tax credit is kind of always 1 year behind. So another nuance, I didn't put in a slide about this. But I want to note, you know, when we're looking at that, at the education fund outlook, and you'll recall line 1B has the property tax credit like booked as a negative revenue. That's one amount where unless you make a policy choice, that number is not going to change. because the FY 26 property tax credit is really reflecting the calculation of the property tax credits that were already earned in FY 25. So you'll see the property amounts coming into the education fund changing based off of policy choices and other things, but you won't be seeing that property tax credit line changing unless I'm asked to model changes to FY 25's property tax credit.
Briefly on the look back the previous year. A number of years ago, we changed from current year to the prior year, and we did that because we had a hole in the budget. And it saved us some $26 million or something like that by looking backwards, and it worked in the budget, but many of us had constituents who were really, really angry. So I'm a guilty party, but anyway, it's an old thing, you know?
And we also did something funny last year where we increased the percentage for a single year. And
Yeah.
Julia asked me if she should include that in the slide or not, and in these slides or not. And I said, I don't think we need to add that layer of complication right now. Let's sort of understand how the system is in its regular statutory state, and then we can talk about how to play with it.
Was there-
Yeah, I mean, it was a great, I think it was a positive move, but we're,
Was that the 13%?
right now, we're just gonna talk about what the system is.
Theoretically, with a lag, if somebody is eligible for that income sensitivity, but that's the first year of their ownership of their property, are they paying the full amount of the property tax bill?
I believe so, John.
I think that's right.
Which, yeah.
And Jake's gonna join us after Julia, so he is more sort of an administrator.
But you benefit far end.
But what?
You benefit when you leave. Yeah, you're gonna get hit one way or the other.
Yeah.
Right.
Back to you, Julie.
Okay. So that was all like the high level math intuition of the property tax credit. I've included an example in case numbers and calculations are helpful. Again, I talked about this for the CLA example. I'll say this again now. This is also purely an example, not supposed to be any sort of policy recommendation, but just to put some numbers into the equations of how these things would work. So in this example, we're assuming that there's a household with an equalized house site value of $350,000 and a household income of $80,000. We're going to assume that this household lives in a district with all of these following parameters. These parameters, the equalized homestead rate, I took as the average rate from the December 1 outlook, just for full disclosure, as well as the income rate. So using these parameters, we can then calculate what their property tax credit would be for the FY 26. So we calculate their homestead property tax. We do that by taking their homestead value. We multiply it by the actual homestead rate. Well, we take the homestead value, we divide it by 100, and we multiply it by the homestead rate, because you'll recall that our property tax rates are per $100 of property value. So that's how we're calculating the homestead property tax of $6,520. We then do the same thing with income. We take the household income, we apply the income rate, and see that if this household were to pay on income, they would pay a total liability of $1,904. So we take the difference between, we see that it would have been cheaper for this household to pay on income rather than property. So we calculate that difference of $4,616 for their property tax credit. But then we need to remember the lag, right? We were just working in FY 26. But we need to think about the lag. So we know that FY 26 property tax credit is not going to be applied until FY 27. So to understand what the FY 26 bill looks like, we need to know what was the property tax credit in FY 25. So here I just made an assumption that literally everything else stayed the same. The only thing that changed was the household saw an increase of 6% on its homestead property tax and income property tax, again, following the December 1 letter. And I ignored, as the chair mentioned, that 13% increase from last year to keep things simple. So this is that same math of homestead property tax, the income property tax, and what the property tax credit would have been in FY 25. So then to think about the property tax credit that that the homeowner, the household would see on its bill, we calculated the FY 26 liability for homestead property tax of $6,520, but we're going to be applying the FY 25 property tax credit of $4,325 to that FY 26 homestead liability. And then the property tax credit in FY 26 will then be applied to FY 27's property tax bill.
So just to clarify, this is partly why in districts that saw rapidly escalating property tax rates last year, this is why a lot of people were caught by surprise. Because their increase wasn't 6%, it was 50 cents in some place. It was significant. So a lot of what we saw last year was a transition effect too. Among other things I'm asking, I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize.
I mean, my point is that if your district saw a 35% increase in tax rate last year, that's much more significant. So the discrepancy between fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26 is much more significant. So that's creating some surprises for people who've been sort of chugging along.
Absolutely. And I will say, and then going to the next slide, this is actually the first consideration that raising here gets exactly to this point, that the property tax credits that folks are seeing on tax bills do not correspond to tax changes in the same fiscal year. So it's true every year. And the smaller the year-to-year changes, the smaller the impact. The converse is also true. The larger the year-to-year changes, the larger the impact.
So will you be able to model this year based on what happened last year? Because we're going to see another big impact this year because of the lag. In some communities.
What do you mean, will I be able to model?
Well, if there was a very big discrepancy last year, it should have qualified some people for a bigger credit that wouldn't be applied until this year, right?
So let me provide a little bit of context and tell me if this answers your question or not, because I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
And I can also talk offline.
Let's have Julia.
Okay, so every year, JFO in consensus with tax, for the December 1 letter, calculate our best estimate of the property tax credit. And so the way that we do that is we have, we calculate for every household, the homestead liability, the income, what the income liability would have been, the delta, and what the property tax credit would have been. So what you see in the FY 26 outlook column for the property tax credit is reflecting our estimate of what the property tax credit will be in FY 26. Does that answer the question?
I think I need to sit down with some numbers and maybe I'll try to work it out and you can tell me where I'm at.
Or were you right? Yeah.
Okay.
Representative Brannigan.
Before we get too much further, I just want to point out that on page 11, these figures are way out of date. The homestead value, I don't know, even in my community, Georgia, just north of Chittenden County, the first town you get to north of Chittenden County, you gotta go all the way through Franklin County before you get to Canada, but I don't know of a house that would sell for 350,000. They all start at like 450 or 5.
My home's worth less than 350. And it's lovely.
It's the region.
It's region.
That's
It is
causing it,
region.
not-
Lovely, it's a lovely home.
But
Yes.
What I'm saying is
Yes.
an income 80,000, you couldn't live in Georgia on 80,000. That's why farmers are going out of business, you know,
So next week, we're actually, and I wish we had put this earlier in testimony, but the world's a complicated place, as is the schedule. We're actually just gonna have a briefing on like the demographics of Vermont, so we actually have a sense of like who we are talking about when we talk about people who pay taxes.
that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I'm sorry that got bumped a couple times, but it will be next week. Yes, so that'll be a nice centering for all of this. Yeah. Yes.
Who does all these calculations? I'm not affected by it, so I've never had to fill out this form. Does the taxpayer fill out all this information in terms of the house site value and calculate the credit? And
So,
you keep track of last year's credit, or does the tax department do that?
so that's the tax department. So, and it's the homestead owner. Property owners who have their property be their principal dwelling, they need to fill out the homestead declaration form.
When you file your income tax, right?
When they're filing their property tax. Generally goes hand in hand along with filing their income tax, all at the same time.
Right, the income tax. You fill out this, yeah, okay.
So the homestead declaration form is actually a separate distinct form solely for the purpose of calculating the property tax credit.
Okay.
And the taxpayer fills out the information, and then the tax department, and Jake is much better aimed to speak to this than I am, because I don't do this work, but they're calculating the property tax credit. The consensus piece that I was talking about is for the purpose of forward-looking to be working in the Edgewin Outlook.
Okay, but the tax department calculates the credit, then they forward that to the town clerk so that the town clerk knows how to write the tax bill.
Let's
I don't know.
Let's have Jake explain that. And if Jake's not the right person, we can have the taxpayer advocate actually should probably be coming in soon. He might be a great person to talk about that because he is there when things go wrong. Yes, Rep. Holcomb, and then let's go back to the presentation.
Yeah, and I think part of what I'm struggling with is, I think sometimes it's helpful to see examples where it works both ways, because then we can see how the changes affect people. Maybe we could do scenario testing in some of them, so we see not just places where the numbers move in one direction, but see how it might impact a community with very rapidly escalating property values, for example. I think it helps. It's not that we question it, it's just it helps us get our heads cognitively around how it's working. If that makes sense. We're a little slower than you.
Yeah.
You live in this.
No. Yeah, so I put this is like, as I said, maybe should be more clear, like really solely an example to show. I'm not saying that the average homestead value is 350,000 or income is 80,000. These are round numbers that help to understand the basics of the property tax credit, nothing more than that.
And we can take more testimony on how it's administered and how and who qualifies for it and all of that. Right now, we're just trying to understand how like the basics of the statute function mathematically. Back to you, Julia.
Okay, so I think we spoke about this, this first bullet I think this was one of Rep. Holcomb's comments, because of the lag, property tax credits on bills don't correspond with tax changes in the same fiscal year. So if tax rates change significantly, if the property changes significantly in value, if a household's income situation changes significantly, all of these factors that impact the calculation of the property tax credit won't be reflected until the following fiscal year. This also means, or also thinking about the lag, that changes to the income yield for fiscal year 26, which is one of the numbers that this committee will be working through with respect to the yield bill, will not impact property taxpayers in FY 26, but will impact property taxpayers in FY 27. So as you're working through the income yield, you won't be seeing corresponding changes of the property tax credit on the Ed Fund Outlook because we're not yet showing the property tax credit that will be appearing on bills until FY 27. So that's big picture, how the property tax credit works. I thought the committee was going to ask about property tax credit recipients. I didn't think that you would be asking about geography or circuit breaker data. I guess wrong. But I put together this chart to help have a sense by income bracket, household income bracket, the number of recipients and the average credit. So what we're looking at here on our x-axis, we've got the household income bracket. This is based on FY22 household income. So we've got to keep all of these years in our mind when thinking about the property tax credit. But our x-axis, we've got the household income bracket. Here on our left-hand Y, we have the number of recipients of a property tax credit in that income bracket. That's corresponding with the blue bars. On our right-hand Y-axis, we have the average education credit, property tax credit. And that's corresponding with these gray dots. So you can see for each income bracket, for instance, the 20,000 to 30,000, there are, I'm not going to guess what number that is, but somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 recipients of a credit, with the average credit falling between 2,000 and 2,500.
Representative Odie and Holcomb.
Thank you. So do you think if people's incomes were rising and their house site values were going way up because COVID, because whatever else, do you think that that would mean that fewer of those people are going to be getting any relief? What would happen? I should ask, what would happen?
Is the question, what would happen if someone's income increases and their property value increases?
Or even if their income stays more the same, their property is going up.
So this is an unsatisfying answer, I know. It really depends on the taxpayer. So it depends on how much their income is growing and how much their property value is growing. And it also depends on the yields that are being set by the General Assembly with respect to those different property tax classes. So it also depends on their school district budget, which is going to be impacting the per pupil spending, which is then also going to be impacting the homestead property tax rate. So there's so many factors that I can't say, their credit would go up or their credit would go down. It would depend on all of these different parameters.
I guess I'm just generally concerned about places in the state where the value of real estate is going way up. Just generally. And all of the things being equal, let's say it never is, but I see that you're saying all those things are involved, but I'm concerned about taxpayers who have then suddenly they just are not getting the kind of relief that they might have gotten before COVID and people were moving in and prices were on housing is going way up and making the value of the properties go way up.
And those are just the kinds of policy issues that we'll tackle this session. Rep. Holcomb.
And I think that's why I love the way you explain it, because you're not shrinking away from the confusion, because there's so many things going on. And I think what I need is to test, if we move this variable, what happens? If we move this variable, what happens? Not to question, but just to understand the dynamic. And here, what's striking is the cliff that our band creates, it looks like, at around 90,000. And when I think of our area, when I look at the labor data, the people leaving our area are people who earn in that band. But it looks like there's a significant drop in the size of the credit on average for people right over that threshold, the cliff. And those are the people who are leaving the state in our data.
I will say,
Which may be inclusive.
a lot of policy considerations, which I can't speak to one way or another. I will say that with respect to some of the modeling that you're referencing, I know the chair mentioned this, but the income-based education tax study committee dedicated its first 2 sessions or a number of sessions looking at pulling all of the different levers and then where would the bubble pop out, right? Because the more generous that you make the property tax credit, then that means that money needs to come from somewhere, right? It's a tax expenditure. So thinking about, so you're pulling this lever, the property tax credit is going up for this group of property taxpayers. That's a policy choice if you want to do that. And if you want to expand that property tax credit, where are the dollars for expanding that property tax credit coming from? Is it coming from folks who are not seeing an expanded property tax credit? Is it coming from cutting something? Is it coming from another revenue stream? All considerations.
One of my, I think one of the more interesting parts of the balloon that's sort of counterintuitive is you can increase the property tax credit. And because the money needs to be made up somewhere, it actually will raise the rates for the folks who are getting the increased property tax credit, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so I really do recommend that report, and it's Julia's modeling that we're referring people back to. So it's a deeper dive into that. We can take more time. We're going to take more testimony on all of that. Back to you, Julia. Want to make sure we have time for Jake?
Yes, this is my second to last slide. This is the final slide, again, referencing the Department of Taxes report on property tax credit recipients. There's a link that's underlined in the bottom of the screen. It's blue if you can see colors. And clicking on that will bring you to that data that we were talking about. But I will also send a link to Sorsha so that she can forward it to the committee to the historic property tax credit data. This is just linking to the most recent year. And that was all I had prepared. Here's a few more links.
For all the link
Thank you.
and for all the work. Anything else for Julia? I know that, well, everything that we talked about brings up 1,000 more questions. That's the nature of the work. And so that it is what it is, but.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jake, are you there inside the computer? Hello. Thanks for joining us again this afternoon.
Yeah, glad to be back. Jake Feldman, Tax Department, and talking about property tax credits. Here's a question about the mechanics of how it all gets filed for and calculated. And the answer on that one is that, like Julia said, when you file your homestead declaration in the spring, which is a requirement of everyone who is going to own and occupy their house as their principal residence, Part B of that form is where you would file for a property tax credit. And in that section, you would report things like your house site value, your house site education taxes, your house site municipal taxes. And those are all coming from a special box on the top of your property tax bill. If you go home and look this weekend, there's a house site tax information box. So you just, the homeowner has to take those things and report them. And the homeowner has to fill out a household income form. And then that information goes to the tax department, and the tax department calculates the credit. And then in the spring, actually around June, the tax department tells the towns for each span, for each property, how much credit should be applied to the bill in the coming year. So that's how it all.
Can you say that last sentence again? I feel like it got swallowed by the internet.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, mine have also been swallowed by my own body, which is, not totally functioning. So it gets, the tax department sends to the towns the credit amounts, education and municipal, by property, and then the town applies those to the bills. They show up on the bills as state payments, which I think is maybe not the best name, but those are the income-based credits that that people are receiving.
Thanks. Marty, I'll bring in my bill for you. That's it.
What
Yeah,
was that?
I'm gonna do that. I just offered to Marty to bring in my bill and just.
No, I see, I know those things are on the bill. I just didn't know how the credit got there. How they tell the town clerk to then make that credit available.
We're proud of you.
Jake, What happens to people who don't file a tax return?
They
How
can-
do they get this advantage? How do
They
get?
can, you don't need to file an income tax return to file a homestead declaration. In fact, many people file homestead declarations and property tax credit claims without filing any income tax return at all. It's totally legitimate. And the reason why it's legitimate is because you only have to file an income tax return if you have enough income to be required to. And that those thresholds are kind of vary, but they're in the 30,000 range. So there's lots of situations where you might have one person who is on Social Security. They're not required to file an income tax return, but they do file the Vermont Homestead Declaration and they file for a property tax credit claim. That being said, we, the tax department are always trying to improve our outreach so that people know that they should file the homestead declaration and a property tax credit claim, and that they may be eligible for income tax relief. So that is something we're always working on, whether they're low income or speak another language that's not English. We are constantly endeavoring to improve that.
Thank you.
Okay, so even the folks that don't qualify, maybe draw in, $12,000 worth of Social Security. With that HS 122 form, they still have to file an HI 144 form?
Oh, that's all that comes.
Okay, yep, thanks.
So you said they don't qualify. You mean they're not required to file an income tax return? Is that
Right,
what you mean?
yeah, that's what I meant.
Yes.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah, so they're gonna have to fill out the household income form, but it may be not that hard. Like if their only income is Social Security, then yeah, they can just report, they'll get a statement from the federal government, SS. I don't remember I can't remember the form right now, but the statement of that, it reports the Social Security income, and then they just would put that on the right line on the household income form, and that's all they would need to do.
Thank you.
I have a couple things on property tax credits that won't take too long.
Would really appreciate that, thanks. And while
I'm
you're
gonna-
pulling that up, John Gray had to step out, but just wanted to let folks know that the 47,000 threshold of the circuit breaker dates back to Act 60, so 1997. Back to you. Thank you so much, Jake.
Great.
Incarnation.
Am I sharing?
You are indeed.
We're sharing.
We can
All
see
right.
it.
Like slightly different than this morning. This morning there was a green box around it, but anyway, we do put out annual statistics on property tax credits that show how many recipients there are in each town, county, and broken out by income group. We also show how many homesteads there are in each town. So a question that comes up a lot, especially for school districts, is, in town XYZ, of all the homesteads, how many qualify for income-based credit? And that is in our annual statistics that Julia mentioned and that I have linked here. And I would have posted those for FY25 already, but I've been sick. So I'm a little bit late, but those should be up really, really soon, like maybe at the beginning of next week. So that'll be the most recent year. And as Julia mentioned in her testimony, there was in FY25 a special 13% increase to property tax credits. So that will be reflected in those totals in that table. The second bullet, there's a ton of information for applicants on our website, including stuff to make the program more accessible, and a credit calculator, which is really important. If you're wondering how much you will receive or a constituent is going to receive in FY26, the coming property tax year, you can use this calculator to figure that out. It's not that hard to use, and we offer that on that link. Was there a question that I kind of started talking over? Okay. The last thing is that in Act 183 of last year, we were asked to study a possibly including an asset declaration in the property tax credit claim, which we looked at and made some recommendations there. And it also asked us about other administrative and policy improvements related to property tax credits. So we took that and ran with it and talked quite a bit about the current system and its challenges, and also some possibilities for alternatives. So I encourage folks to check that out. And there's one particular table from that report that I'd like to discuss for a second. So I know that probably a lot of you, were on school boards at some point. I am on a school board right now. At times it does drive me crazy. We have public comment at the beginning of each meeting, and once in a while, someone will come up and they'll make a statement such as, yes, taxes are going up a lot in Montpelier, but 2/3 of the homeowners are income sensitized, so they don't need to worry about it. And that is very frustrating because for a variety of reasons, but it's not true. The income rates do move with per pupil spending is one of the reasons. But it's also frustrating because there's like an element of truth for some homeowners, but it's mostly not true. But it's just a very confusing system overall, and it makes it so that school boards, and what I mean by it is income sensitivity, and makes it so that school boards can't produce a simple table to show people what they will pay in the coming year if they vote for the school budget. And in our current system, the only cost control mechanism is the decisions of local voters. But the local voters, have many challenges to knowing what they're going to pay. And one of them is the complexity of income sensitivity. Julia showed how there are different thresholds in the program where things change. Like at $47,000 of income, that's where the circuit breaker ends. And up to 47,000, there's kind of fixed rates in law. And then after that, there's the moving rate with per pupil spending. And then for households up to 90,000 of income, it covers up to $400,000 of house site value. But after that, it drops off to 225. Those are two major thresholds that are important. Another thing is that for households under 47, there's a special provision called a house site exclusion value, where if your taxes based on your value of your house site minus $15,000 are less than what you'd pay based on income, you can get a credit based on that. And that is because at some point around Act 60, somebody realized that people in low value properties mostly don't benefit from income sensitivity. So there's all these intersecting components, and what it actually makes is that the question of how do different households pay for education really vary quite a bit. There are households who pay based on income. For those in the circuit breaker population, about 90% are paying based on income, and they are paying locked rates that don't reflect per pupil spending. 4% are paying a combination of income and property because their house site value is worth more than $400,000. And then 6% are paying entirely based on property, and they're getting that house site exclusion value. For 47 to 90, 80%, you could say, are paying on income, but it's different because they're not paying locked on income. They're paying the income rate that floats with per pupil spending. And then 8% are paying on income and property because they have house site value over 400. And then 12% are paying purely based on property. And that is because their property is not worth enough to qualify them for a credit. Because like Julia said, you have to have a difference between what you'd pay on property and what you pay on income. And if your property is not worth enough, you don't get any credit at all. And so another thing that bothers me that I hear is that, you know, all low or moderate income people benefit from income sensitivity, and that's not true. You need to have a property value of a certain amount to benefit. Otherwise, you would pay on property because it's lower. And this is for FY24, so the upper income threshold is a bit higher, but between 90 and 128, 12% are paying based on income, but the majority are paying on income and property because in that income range, it only covers you up to 225 in house site value, and their houses tend to be worth more than 225. And then 26% are paying entirely based on property because the math doesn't give them an advantage of a credit there. And then, of course, over 128 in that year, it would be entirely based on property because that's where the program ended that year. But the hyper complicated mix is really challenging to work through. I work with school districts a lot on you know, they ask me like, can you help us make a table to show what people will pay? And you know, it is basically impossible to do. So that's a really frustrating element. And I encourage you to check out that report because there's a lot of discussion of the current system in it.
And I'm hoping that we're having you in soon to talk about the report in greater depth.
Awesome.
Mhm.
I'm looking forward to that.
Me too. Do you have anything you'd like to share with us today?
I don't think so. Just that last
Okay.
minute on the complexity of income sensitivity.
Thank you. Any questions from anyone here?
Hope you feel better, Jake,
Oh, thank you.
sitting with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for your time, Jake. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a restful weekend.
Thanks so much.
Folks, we are done for the day. Really encourage, I think there's a lot of lingering questions for everyone. Encourage you to make a list of your lingering questions before you leave for the week. Feel free to print out reports. Julia's, there are multiple presentations, past presentations about the common level of appraisal explicitly that can, Sorsha can help you find if you can't find yourself on the Ways and Means website. And we will see you next Tuesday after the floor and caucuses and lunch and all of those things. And the agenda.